The morning Maude Hadley buried her father, the banker in Colton Ridge gave her exactly 1 season to prove that the land was worth keeping, or he would take every last acre of it. She stood at the grave with dry eyes and dirty hands, the red Kansas dirt still caked beneath her fingernails from digging the hole herself, because there was no one else to do it. Her father, Thomas Hadley, had been a stubborn man with a beautiful dream, and that dream was 160 acres of hard prairie land that he had claimed under the Homestead Act back in 1872 and spent the following 11 years trying to tame. He had not quite succeeded. The soil along the eastern ridge was good, the creek that ran through the middle of the property still flowed clean and clear, and there were 3 years of fence posts that marched across the land in reasonably straight lines. But the debt was heavy. Thomas had borrowed against the property twice, once to build the barn and once after a drought year stole the corn crop entirely, and now in the spring of 1883 the debt had come due. Maude was 24 years old. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's jaw, brown hair that she kept pinned tightly under a wide-brimmed hat, and hands that had never once been soft or idle. She had been working this land since she was old enough to carry a water bucket, and she was not going to let Randall Prout at the Colton Ridge Savings and Loan take it from her without a fight. Randall Prout was 51, pink-faced, and professionally sympathetic in the way that men who held other people's futures in ledger books sometimes managed to be. He had come out to the farm on the very afternoon of the funeral, which told Maude everything she needed to know about his character. He had stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and his eyes roaming the room the way a buyer's eyes rove over livestock at auction. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Hadley," he had said, and Maude had looked at him steadily over the rim of her coffee cup and said nothing until he felt uncomfortable enough to get to the point. The point was this. The loan balance remaining was $340. The collateral was the farm. Thomas Hadley had signed the note, and with Thomas Hadley dead, the note fell to his estate, which was his only surviving child and heir, Maude. She had until the 1st of October, nearly 5 months away, to either repay the balance or demonstrate that the farm was productive enough to support a renegotiated arrangement. If she could show Prout a harvest that justified the land's value, he had the authority to restructure the debt on reasonable terms. If she could not, the bank would foreclose in October and the land would be auctioned. 5 months, she had said flatly. 1 season, Prout had confirmed, with a small nod that he probably thought was compassionate. After he left, Maude sat at her kitchen table for a long time in the lengthening April light and did not cry. She made a list instead. The list was long and the resources she had to work with were short, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had believed in writing things down. She had a team of 2 good draft horses, a bay mare named Sunday and a gray gelding named Luther. She had a plow, a harrow, a seed drill that needed 1 bolt replaced, and approximately $40 in cash money saved in a tin box under the kitchen floorboards. She had seed winter wheat saved from the year before, and a good supply of sorghum and corn seed she had purchased at the end of the previous autumn when prices were low. She had the barn, which was sturdy. She had the house, which was livable. She had the creek and the fence posts and the eastern ridge soil and 160 acres of possibility. What she did not have was another pair of hands. She knew it before she finished writing the list. One woman working 160 acres through planting season alone was not impossible, but it was very close to impossible, and close to impossible had a way of becoming actually impossible in the face of bad weather, equipment failures, and the 1,000 small disasters that farming in Kansas was famous for producing. Her nearest neighbor, a widow named Clara Fitch, was 7 miles east and in no better position than Maude herself. The men in Colton Ridge who hired out for field work had already contracted themselves to the larger operations for the season. She went to bed that first night after the funeral with the list on the table and a candle burned down to the stub, telling herself she would figure it out in the morning. What she could not have anticipated was that morning would bring Harvey Slater. He arrived on the second day of her new life as a woman alone on a disputed farm, riding a dark chestnut horse with a white blaze down its nose, and leading a mule loaded with a bedroll, a toolbox, and a canvas bag of provisions. Maude heard the hoofbeats from the east field where she was walking the fence line with a hammer, checking posts, and she straightened up with the hammer still in her hand, and watched the rider come across the low rise that separated her property from the Colton Ridge Road. He was not a large man, but he sat a horse well, easy and upright in the way of someone who had spent the better part of his life in a saddle. She could see as he got closer that he was somewhere in his early 30s, with a clean-shaved face that was weathered to a dark tan, dark eyes set wide apart under the brim of a worn brown hat, and the kind of stillness about him that some men carried when they had learned to be quiet in wide-open country. He stopped his horse at the fence and looked at her. She looked back at him. "This the Hadley place?" he asked. "It is," she said. "Was." He noticed the fresh mound of dirt on the rise where she had buried her father, and his expression shifted into something quiet and respectful. He took his hat off. "I heard in town about Thomas. I am sorry. Did you know my father?" "I worked 2 seasons on the Brenner operation north of here. Your father and I shared a fence line one spring and got to talking. He mentioned you often." He paused. "Said you were the best hand he had ever worked with and that it was a shame about certain arrangements the world had made that kept women from being taken seriously in matters of land and business." Maude studied him. "He said that." "Something close to it. He was drinking coffee at the time, so his words had a particular clarity." There was a hint of warmth in his voice, not quite a smile but close to one. "My name is Harvey Slater. I was heading west, through to Colorado. But I stopped in Colton Ridge last night for a meal and heard what Prout was saying about the Hadley place, and I changed my direction." "You changed your direction," she repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am. To come here." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a long moment. The prairie wind moved through the grass around them. Somewhere in the middle distance, Luther the gelding was moving along the fence line, eating down the early spring growth. The sky above them was enormous and pale and streaked with morning cloud. "Mr. Slater," she said carefully, "I appreciate that you knew my father and I appreciate the sentiment, but I am not in a position to hire help. I do not have the money, and even if I did, I would not be interested in charity." Harvey Slater nodded slowly, as though she had said something he had expected. He looked out across the field for a moment, taking in the fence line, the barn beyond, the turned earth where she had already started breaking ground on the south section. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering a partnership." "A partnership? You have land, I have labor and skills. You have seed, I can handle a plow. You have 5 months to show Prout this operation can produce." He looked back at her. "I am not asking for wages. I am asking for a share of the crop if we succeed, and if we do not succeed, I walk away with nothing and you are no worse off than you were this morning. And if we do succeed, then you keep your land, I take 10% of the harvest value, and we part on good terms." Maude turned this over in her mind. She was careful with trust. She had been raised in a household where trust was given slowly and always earned, and she was particularly careful with men who appeared without warning bearing solutions to problems she had not yet asked for help with. But she was also a practical woman. She looked at his hands, which were resting easy on the saddle horn, and she could see even at this distance that they were working hands. She looked at his horse, which was well kept and calm. She looked at the mule, which was loaded in an organized and efficient way that spoke to a man who paid attention to details. "Can you fix a seed drill?" she asked. "Depends on what is wrong with it." "A bolt, the secondary shaft attachment." He tilted his head slightly. "Yes, I can do that." "Can you handle a team?" "Sunday and Luther. If those are your horses I saw in the corral, then yes. I have handled heavier teams than that." She looked at him for a long moment. The weight of everything, the debt, the empty house, the impossible list on her kitchen table, pressed down on her. And underneath that weight was something else, something that had been pressing since the moment Randall Prout walked away from her farm. It was the recognition that being proud and being practical were not always the same thing, and that her father, who had believed in working hard and accepting help in equal measure, would have shaken this man's hand without hesitation. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "I will not have you in the house. There is a wood stove out there and the loft is dry." "That is entirely suitable," he said. "You fix the seed drill today. Tomorrow we start on the south field." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Slater," she said, meeting his dark eyes directly, "if you are the kind of man who changes his mind about an agreement halfway through, I need you to tell me right now. I have enough problems. I do not need unreliable ones." He held her gaze steadily. "I am not that kind of man," he said. She believed him. She was not entirely sure why she believed him, except that there was something in the way he said it, without ornamentation, without bluster, that felt like the truth. She nodded once, a sharp little movement, and turned back to the fence line. "Barn is that way," she said over her shoulder. "Tools are on the left wall." She heard him dismount behind her, heard the soft sound of him leading his horse and the mule toward the barn, and she went back to checking fence posts and told herself very firmly that she had made a practical decision and not a hopeful one. She was not entirely successful at convincing herself. Harvey had the seed drill fixed by noon. Maude came in from the east field at midday to find him at the workbench in the barn. The drill's secondary shaft disassembled in front of him, with the precision of someone who understood mechanical things, the way some people understood language. He had found the spare bolts in the tin on the wall. She had organized them by size, which he noticed, and he had fitted the correct one and was reassembling the mechanism with practiced steadiness. He did not look up when she came in, which she appreciated. Some men who were aware of being observed made a performance of their work. Harvey simply continued working. "I will start lunch," she said. "I can eat later," he said, without looking up. "I want to test the action before I leave this." "Suit yourself." She made cornbread and fried salt pork and ate at the kitchen table alone, the way she had eaten every meal since her father died, and looked out the window at the barn and thought about the complication she had just introduced into her carefully managed situation. Then she thought about the alternative, which was attempting this alone, and she ate the rest of her cornbread in peace. Harvey came in for his lunch an hour later, leaving his hat on the hook by the door without being asked, which told her he was a man who paid attention to other people's spaces. She had kept a plate warm for him on the back of the stove. He sat at the table without preamble and ate with the efficient focus of a man who had been working since early morning and intended to continue. "The drill will be ready tomorrow," he said. "Good. The second stall in the barn has a loose board on the east wall. It will let in rain if the season turns wet. I can get that fixed this afternoon if you have the nails." "I have nails." "I noticed the creek bank is eroding at the north curve." "Not immediate problem, but over the summer it could take out about 10 feet of your pasture edge." She looked at him. "You noticed all that this morning." "I look at things when I arrive somewhere," he said. "It is a habit." She considered this. "The nail box is on the middle shelf in the barn, left side." He nodded and went back to his lunch. By evening they had fallen into a rhythm that surprised her with its ease. He worked without requiring direction, which was both unusual and enormously useful. He seemed to have an instinctive understanding of what needed doing and a quiet confidence in doing it. When she came back from checking the creek in the late afternoon, she found him repairing the stall board with careful, even hammer blows, and the barn smelled of fresh-cut pine and hay and horse. And for the first time in 3 days, Maude did not feel the full weight of everything pressing down on her quite so heavily. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him work for a moment before she spoke. "My father borrowed money twice," she said. "The second time was after the drought year, 1880. He tried to tell me it was fine, but I could see in the ledger that it was not fine." She paused. "I am telling you this because you should know what you are working toward. It is not a comfortable situation." Harvey set his hammer down and turned to look at her. The last light of the day was coming through the barn's high window and cutting across the space between them. "I understand what I agreed to," he said. "$340 by October. We have 160 acres and a good seed supply." "What percentage did you plan to put under wheat?" 70 acres under wheat, 40 under corn. I was thinking sorghum on the sandy section near the west fence." He considered this. "That is a reasonable plan if we get the wheat in by the end of April and the corn in early May, and if the weather holds through June, you should have a harvest in August that will cover the debt and leave some margin." "If," she said. "Always if," he agreed. "That is farming." She looked at him for a moment. "You know farming." "I know a great many things," he said with that near smile again. "I have had to learn quickly in most of the places I have been." "Where have you been?" He was quiet for a moment. "Everywhere between here and the Mississippi mostly. Missouri, where I grew up. Tennessee before that, though I do not talk about Tennessee much. I drove cattle up the Kishom Trail twice in '77 and '78. Spent a winter trapping in the Colorado mountains. Worked 2 seasons on the Brenner operation, as I said. I have been a great many things, Miss Hadley. Mostly I have been a man looking for a place that felt worth staying." She absorbed this. "And Kansas does not strike you as that place?" "I have not decided yet," he said, and his eyes held hers for just a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. She looked away first. "Breakfast is at 5:30, she said. "I do not make it twice if someone is late." "I will not be late," he said. He was not. He was up before she was, and when she came down the ladder from the sleeping loft above the kitchen, she could hear him outside already moving through the morning chores, water drawn and horses fed, and the sound of the axe splitting wood for the kitchen fire. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him work in the gray pre-dawn light and felt something strange and inconvenient move through her chest. She put the coffee on and told herself it was simply relief. The first full week of planting was the hardest work Maude had done in a life that had never been short of hard work. They started on the south field with Sunday and Luther on the plow, Harvey handling the team while Maude followed with the harrow, breaking the turned clods into fine seed-ready soil. The Kansas spring was cold and damp that year, which was good for moisture but hard on bodies that had been bent over fields since before dawn. Her back ached every evening. Her hands, which she had thought were already calloused beyond further feeling, found new places to blister. But they made progress. Real, measurable progress. By the end of the first week, the south field was turned and harrowed and ready for seed. And Harvey had fixed the seed drill, and they had spent the last 2 days of the week working in companionable near silence. One walking the drill rows while the other managed the seed supply, and they watched the wheat seed disappear into the dark earth in long, even lines. In the evenings, Maude cooked. Harvey split wood and checked the animals and made small repairs around the property, with a tirelessness that she could not help but admire, even when she was trying not to pay attention to him. They ate together at the kitchen table, which had been her father's table and his father's before that, a solid oak thing that had crossed the Missouri River on a wagon and survived 11 Kansas winters. The conversations that happened at that table began as practical exchanges of plans for the following day, assessment of the week's progress, discussions of seed quantities and soil conditions and weather signs, and then, slowly, began to expand into other territory. It was Harvey who first made her laugh. It was a Tuesday evening in the second week of May, and they had been talking about the sorghum section near the west fence, which had turned out to have better drainage than she had expected, and somehow, she was not entirely sure how. The conversation had moved to the subject of mules, and Harvey was describing an incident involving a particularly obstinate mule named Percival on the Brenner operation, and the story involved a watering trough, an unexpected rainstorm, and Percival's inconvenient decision to sit down in the middle of the field access road and refuse to move for 2 hours. And by the time Harvey finished telling it, Maude's sides were aching with laughter she had not anticipated and had not had room for in weeks. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at him across the table with wet eyes, not sad eyes but actually laughing eyes, And Harvey was watching her with that expression. She was beginning to recognize warm and quiet and just slightly undone, as though her laughter was doing something to him that he had not expected either. "I am sorry," she managed. "I cannot, Percival." Was a profoundly determined animal, Harvey said, and the near smile became an actual smile, and Maude saw for the first time what Harvey Slater looked like when he was fully, unguardedly happy, and it was a sight that settled somewhere in her chest and did not move. She looked back at her coffee cup. "My father would have liked that story," she said more quietly. "I know. I told it to him once. He almost choked on his coffee." She looked up. "You told him that story, and several others. We talked a great deal that spring. We shared a fence line. He was a good man, Miss Hadley. He was very proud of you." She did not speak for a moment. "He never said so," she said finally, because it was honest. "Men of his generation frequently did not say the things they felt most strongly," Harvey said. "But he said it to me. He said his daughter was going to outlast all of them, every banker and every drought and every bad season Kansas could produce, and that the land would be hers because she was the only one who truly understood what it was worth." Maude set her coffee cup down very carefully. Her throat was tight. "He said that. He said that." She stood up from the table, which she needed to do because she could feel the grief coming up in a wave that she had been holding back for 3 weeks, and she was not ready to let it go in front of this man she had known for 14 days. She carried the cups to the wash basin and stood with her back to him and breath through her nose and waited for the wave to crest and recede. Behind her, Harvey did not say anything. He did not offer comfort in words or movement. He simply sat quietly at her father's table and let her have the moment that she needed, and that silence was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since Thomas Hadley died. When she turned back around, she was steady. "I think we can start the corn section by Thursday if the weather holds," she said. "I think so too," he agreed, and went back to the rest of his coffee as though nothing had happened and everything had happened. May in Kansas brought thunderstorms. The first big one arrived in the 3rd week of May. A blue-black wall of cloud that came rolling in from the northwest on a Wednesday afternoon, while Harvey was working the corn section with Luther, and Maude was on the north pasture, checking the fence she had been repairing all week. She saw it coming from a long way off. Anyone who had grown up on the Kansas plains learned to read the sky the way other people read books, and she abandoned the fence and ran for the barn, whistling for Sunday as she went. Harvey had already seen it. He had unhitched Luther from the corn drill and was leading him to the barn at a trot when she came through the gate, Sunday at her heels. They worked together wordlessly and fast, getting the horses into the stalls and latching the barn doors and securing the loose equipment, while the first fat drops of rain began to hit the roof. The storm broke fully when they were barely inside, and it was the kind of storm that meant business hail first, small but emphatic, rattling against the barn roof like gravel thrown by an angry hand, then rain coming sideways in solid sheets, and lightning cracking the sky open with a violence that made the horses stamp and blow in their stalls. Maude and Harvey stood side by side in the barn's interior and watched through the cracked door as the storm did what it was going to do to the fields. The wheat that was already up 4 inches on the south field was bending flat. The newly planted corn rows were filling with water. "The drainage should be enough on the corn section," Harvey said over the noise of the rain on the roof. "Should be," she agreed. "The wheat will come back up once the wind eases, if there is no hail damage to the stems." "The hail is too small for stem damage." She looked at him. "You sound very confident about that." "I am not confident about anything," he said, "but I am cautiously optimistic." The storm raged for 2 hours. They sat in the barn during it. There was nothing to be done, nowhere to be, no productive response to a Kansas thunderstorm except to wait it out. And they sat on overturned feed buckets near the horses, and the conversation they had was different from all the other conversations that had happened at the kitchen table. It was the conversation of 2 people confined together in a small space by forces outside their control, which is a particular kind of conversation that strips away a great deal of the usual social scaffolding. Harvey told her about Tennessee. He had grown up there on a small farm not unlike this one, with parents who had died of fever when he was 17, within 6 months of each other, which had left him the farm but no particular desire to stay on it alone. He had sold it to a neighbor for far less than it was worth because he was 17 and grieving, and the neighbor had been persistent, and he had taken the money and headed west, and he had been heading west in one form or another ever since. "Do you regret selling it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The hail had stopped and the rain was settling into a steadier, more sustainable rhythm. "Long time I did," he said. "I was angry about it for years, not at the neighbor who was just taking an opportunity that presented itself, but at myself for not having the presence of mind to wait. But I was 17 and the world was very large, and staying alone on 40 acres in Tennessee seemed like a kind of slow disappearing." He looked down at his hands. "I understand now, better than I did then, what my parents built on that land. I understand what it meant to them. I did not understand it then because I had not yet had anything of my own to value." She looked at him. "Is that why you came here? Because you understood what this land meant to my father?" He was quiet for a moment before he answered, and the quality of the quiet was careful and honest. "Partly," he said, "and partly because when I heard what Prout was planning, I felt something that I have not felt since I was 17 years old and making a very poor decision about my own land." "Which was?" "The strong conviction that something valuable was about to be lost unnecessarily, and that I was in a position to do something about it." He met her eyes. "I do not believe in letting things that matter be lost without a fight, Miss Hadley. Your father believed the same thing. He told me so." The rain had dropped to a murmur now. Beyond the barn door, the prairie was wet and gleaming, and the sky was beginning to clear in long gold and lavender strips along the western horizon. "You could have gone to Colorado," she said. "You said you were heading to Colorado." "I could have," he agreed. She stood up from the feed bucket and looked out through the cracked barn door at the soaked and shining fields. The wheat on the south field was already beginning to straighten, she could see, the young stems pushing themselves upright with the quiet determination of things that were built to withstand storms. "Well," she said, "I am glad you did not." She did not look at him when she said it. She walked out of the barn into the rain-clean evening air and did not look back. But she knew he was watching her go, and she knew he was smiling, and she was smiling too, out in the open air where no one could see it. June came in warm and generous. The wheat on the south field was knee-high and green and strong, and the corn was coming up in the sandy east section in thick, confident rows that made Maude stand at the field's edge in the early morning and feel something close to joy. The sorghum on the west section was doing better than expected, the improved drainage making up for the lighter soil, and the creek had not eroded further at the north curve since Harvey had spent a Saturday afternoon reinforcing the bank with stones and timber. Harvey. She had stopped being careful about how often she thought about him. There was a limit to the energy one could spend on being careful about something that was already happening. The thing that was already happening was this. She had begun to look for him in the mornings, before she was fully awake, in that liminal space between the sleeping loft and the kitchen. She would listen for the sound of his movements in the yard and feel something settle in her when she heard them. She had begun to be aware of his moods in the precise, detailed way that you are aware of another person's moods when you live and work in close proximity with them, and have started, without entirely meaning to care about them. She knew the particular stillness that meant he was working through a problem. She knew the way he tilted his head when she said something that surprised him. She knew that he liked his coffee strong and that he was quietly but genuinely delighted by fresh bread, and that on Sunday evenings he sometimes sat on the porch steps after dark and looked at the stars with an expression of such peaceful absorption that she had stood at the kitchen window on more than one occasion and watched him and thought about things she had no business thinking about. He was careful with her. That was what she noticed most. He was careful in the way of a man who was aware of the significance of the space he occupied, her land, her home, her father's memory, and who did not wish to press beyond what he had been offered. He worked with total dedication. He fixed things without being asked. He was easy to talk to and easy to be quiet with, and he did not press her for more than she was willing to give, which in the early weeks of their arrangement had been only professional partnership and the occasional evening conversation. But June was warm and the fields were growing, and the evenings were long and golden, and professional partnership had expanded, without particular announcement, into something that lived in a different category. It was the evening she found the wildflowers that she knew things had shifted, in a way she could no longer reasonably categorize as practical. She had come back from checking the north fence to find a bundle of prairie wildflowers, wild indigo and plains phlox, and bright orange Indian paintbrush, sitting on the kitchen windowsill in a jar of water. No note, no explanation. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them for a long moment, and felt the back of her throat go tight in the way it had not since the night at the kitchen table when Harvey told her what her father had said. Harvey came in for supper an hour later and sat down at the table and did not mention the flowers, and she did not mention them either, but they were both aware of them sitting in the jar on the windowsill, the bright orange of the paintbrush catching the last of the day's light. She set his plate in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "The Indian paintbrush is very fine this year." He looked at her, and his dark eyes were warm and direct. "It is," he said. "I particularly like it on the windowsill," she said, "where the light reaches it in the evenings." He said nothing, but the near smile became the actual smile, and she looked back at her plate and ate her supper feeling something light and warm in her chest that she was fairly certain was what happiness felt like when it arrived unexpectedly in the middle of a situation that still had a great many difficult things in it. She was not foolish enough to believe that happiness and difficulty could not coexist. She had grown up on a Kansas farm. The conversation she needed to have with Harvey about what was growing between them was preempted, as so many important conversations are, by a practical crisis. It was a Thursday in the middle of June when Randall Prout came back. He arrived in the early afternoon in a hired buggy, with a younger man in a city suit sitting beside him, who turned out to be an associate from the bank's parent company in Topeka. This man's name was Whitfield, and he had the smooth, carefully composed manner of someone who dealt in financial abstractions and had little experience with the realities of what those abstractions meant to actual human beings. Maude was in the south wheat field when she saw the buggy coming up the road. She wiped her hands on her work apron and walked to meet them at the gate, and Harvey, who had been working the west fence section, saw the buggy and came in across the field to stand beside her, which she noted without comment. Prout climbed down from the buggy with his sympathetic expression already in place. Whitfield followed him, looking at the farm the way people who are calculating square footage look at things. "Miss Hadley," Prout said, "I hope you will forgive the unannounced visit. Mr. Whitfield is conducting a review of the bank's properties and accounts, and I wanted to be certain everything was in order." "Everything is in order," Maude said. Prout glanced at Harvey, and his expression shifted slightly. "I was not aware you had help." "I am aware of what you were and were not aware of," Maude said pleasantly. "The farm operates as I see fit. Now, you said you wanted to see that everything is in order. I am happy to show you the fields." She led them through the south wheat field first, and she could see Whitfield's expression change as they walked between the rows of strong, tall wheat that was approaching waist height and green as June could make it. She walked them through the corn section, which was coming in beautifully, the stalks thick and well-spaced, and the sorghum on the west section, which was healthy and dense. Harvey walked a few paces behind the group, saying nothing, but Maude was aware of his presence the way she was always aware of his presence now, like a reliable point of orientation. Whitfield stopped at the edge of the cornfield and looked at it for a long time. "This is further along than I expected," he said finally, to Prout, in a tone that suggested the progress was inconvenient to some plan he had been formulating. The land is productive, Maude said. As I could have told Mr. Prout in April if he had thought to ask rather than threaten. Prout made a pained face. I would not characterize what occurred as a threat, Miss Hadley. I would, she said evenly. And I believe that what you will see here today is sufficient to support the renegotiated arrangement you mentioned in April. I intend to have a full wheat harvest in August and corn in September. The numbers will more than service the debt, and I would like to discuss the terms of the restructuring. Whitfield looked at her steadily. He was the kind of man who was accustomed to people being deferential to him, and she was not being deferential. After a moment he said, "Your operation does appear to be viable, Miss Hadley. I will review the account when we return to Topeka and send terms in writing." "I will expect them within 2 weeks," she said. "And I will have a lawyer in Colton Ridge review them before I sign anything." Whitfield blinked. Then he said, "Of course," in a tone that suggested he had slightly revised his assessment of who he was dealing with. Prout looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who had expected a much simpler situation. He glanced again at Harvey as they walked back to the buggy. "Your hired man," he said to Maude more quietly. "What are his terms?" "I want to be certain there are no claims against the property I am not aware of. My arrangement with Mr. Slater is between Mr. Slater and myself," Maude said. "It does not create any claim against the property. I can have my lawyer confirm that in writing if you like." Prout opened his mouth and then closed it again. He climbed back into the buggy and Whitfield followed him, and Maude stood at the gate and watched them drive away down the Colton Ridge Road with her hands folded in front of her and her chin up, and it was not until the buggy had disappeared over the rise that she exhaled. Harvey came to stand beside her. "Well done," he said. "I was not sure about the lawyer part," she said. "I am not certain Colton Ridge has a lawyer who would be useful. There is one in Garrison, 15 miles south. He is not brilliant, but he is honest, which is more than sufficient for this purpose." She turned to look at him. "How do you know about the lawyer in Garrison? I spent an afternoon there 2 weeks ago, when you sent me for the replacement parts for the harrow. I like to know the geography of a situation." She studied him. The June sun was full and golden on the fields around them, the wheat moving in the warm afternoon wind in long green waves that were about the most beautiful sight she had ever seen because of what they meant. "You have been preparing for this," she said. "You knew Prout would come back." "I thought he might. Men like Prout often test the resolve of someone they think might buckle. And you thought I needed backup." "I thought you did not need backup," he said carefully. "I thought you might appreciate knowing the options." She looked at him for a long moment, and something opened up in her chest, something warm and wide and a little terrifying in the way that things that matter are frequently terrifying. "Harvey," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice it, something shifting in the stillness of his face. "Maude," he said, equally quiet. She looked away across the fields. The wheat was moving in the wind. The sky was enormous and blue, and full of the ordinary miracle of a good June day. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to tell it to you plainly because I am not a woman who is comfortable with indirectness." "I know that about you," he said. "I would not expect otherwise." She took a breath. "When you came here in April, you said you would not let me do this alone, and you have kept that. Every single day you have kept that, and I need you to know that it has meant—" She stopped, tried again. "I was prepared to do this alone. I am capable of doing this alone. But I am very glad I have not had to." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. "Maude," he said very quietly. "I am not finished," she said. "I know I am waiting." She turned to look at him directly. "I am not speaking about the farming arrangement," she said. "I am speaking about the other thing, the thing that has been sitting in the room between us since some time in May." He looked at her steadily, and his dark eyes were warm and direct and unguarded in a way she had not seen before, even in all the evenings at the kitchen table and the 2 hours in the barn during the thunderstorm. "I know what you are speaking about," he said. "Then say it plainly," she said. "Because I said it plainly." He was quiet for just a moment, as though arranging words that he wanted to get exactly right. I came here because of the land and because of your father and because of Prute's intentions, he said. All of that is true, but I have stayed, and I want to be clear with you that I want to stay, not just through October but after October. I have stayed because of you, Maude. Because you are the most remarkable person I have been in the presence of in all the years I have been moving through the world, and because somewhere around the third week of April, I stopped heading for Colorado and started hoping that Kansas might be the place I was looking for. She looked at him, and her heart was doing something large and complicated in her chest. You are 32 years old, she said, because this was one of the things she needed to say. Yes, and you have not been in one place for more than 2 seasons in 15 years. No, that is something I need to consider. I know, he said. I would not ask you not to consider it. I would only ask you to also consider that a man who was looking for a place worth staying has been considerably informed over the past 2 months about what that place looks like. And what does it look like? She asked, knowing what he would say, wanting to hear him say it. It looks like 160 acres of good Kansas land with a woman on it who loves it the way most people love the best things in their lives, he said, and who makes cornbread and fixes fence posts and refuses to be beaten by a spring thunderstorm or a banker or a bad season. He paused, and who laughs at stories about stubborn mules. She felt the smile come before she could prevent it, and she did not try to prevent it. Harvey Slater, she said. Maude Hadley, he said. And the wheat moved in the wind all around them, and he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood like that in the long golden afternoon light on the land she was fighting to keep, and it was the most natural thing in the world. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Not easier, because the work of a farm in high summer was never easy, but richer. There is a particular fullness to life when the person you have discovered you love is also the person you work beside every day, when love and purpose are woven together in the same hours and the same ground. They talked differently now. Not just about the farm, though the farm was always there, the wheat coming into head, the corn filling out, the sorghum dense and dark green in the western section, but about everything else too. In the evenings on the porch, when the heat of the day had eased and the fireflies were beginning in the grass, they talked about Tennessee and about Thomas Hadley and about what it meant to belong to a place. Harvey told her about driving cattle up the Kishom Trail, the enormous scale of it, thousands of cattle moving across the Indian Territory with a small crew of men, the nights under open sky with no shelter but the stars, the particular freedom and particular loneliness of that life. Did you ever think about stopping, she asked. Along the way, just stopping and staying somewhere. Several times, he said. There was a valley in Colorado I thought about for a long time, beautiful country, but it was not right. How did you know it was not right? He looked at her in the soft evening light. The same way I know when something is right, he said. You feel it differently. You feel it in a way that is not just appreciation for a beautiful thing, but recognition. Like finding something you did not know you had lost. She understood exactly what he meant, because that was how she felt about the land, and increasingly it was how she felt about him. Clara Fitch, Maude's nearest neighbor, came visiting on a Saturday in late June, driving her wagon the 7 miles from her place with a jar of preserved plums and a great deal of curiosity. Clara was 53, stout, sensible, and had been widowed for 6 years. She had known Thomas Hadley well, and had an obvious maternal feeling toward Maude that Maude accepted with more grace than she accepted most unsolicited concern. Clara arrived at the noon hour, when Maude and Harvey were both at the kitchen table eating lunch, and she took in the situation with the swift, comprehensive eye of a woman who had raised 4 children, and could read a room in approximately 3 seconds. Well, she said, setting the plums on the table and looking at Harvey with open appraisal. I heard in Colton Ridge there was a man out here helping. I did not know he was so young or so presentable. Harvey stood and extended his hand. Harvey Slater, ma'am. I am pleased to meet you. Clara Fitch. I am Maude's neighbor and closest thing to family she has got in this part of the world, which means I am going to be direct. She sat down at the table without being invited, which was entirely Clara's way. "Are your intentions toward this woman and this property honorable?" "Clara," Maude said with feeling. "I am asking what needs to be asked," Clara said serenely, helping herself to the cornbread. Harvey sat back down and looked at Clara with evident respect. "My intentions are entirely honorable," he said, "toward both the property and Miss Hadley." "He says Miss Hadley," Clara noted to Maude. "That is a good sign." "We have a business arrangement," Maude said, aware that this description was now significantly inadequate. Clara looked between them with the satisfied expression of a woman who had read a room in 3 seconds and been entirely correct about everything. "Of course you do," she said, and took a bite of cornbread. She stayed 3 hours, and by the end of it she had given Maude her unsolicited but genuinely warm endorsement of Harvey Slater, on the grounds that his eyes were honest, and his hands showed real work, and he looked at Maude when Maude was not looking at him in the specific way that meant something significant. "I will tell you," Clara said to Maude privately while Harvey was checking the horses. "Your father would have approved. He worried about you after, about what would happen to you out here alone." "He never said so," Maude said. "Men of his generation," Clara said simply, and patted Maude's hand. July was the month of heat and waiting. The wheat was in head, the kernels forming and filling, the field a sea of gold and green that Maude walked the edges of every morning just to see. The corn was tasseling. The sorghum was flowering. Everything that could be done had been done, and now the season moved on its own terms in its own time, and there was nothing to do but maintain and watch and pray for reasonable weather. The heat was significant. Kansas July heat was not a gentle thing. It pressed down from a bleached white sky with the full weight of itself, and the work of the farm had to be managed around it, starting before dawn and breaking in the worst of the midday hours, and resuming in the late afternoon when the air began to move again. During the midday break, they sat on the porch in whatever shade the roof overhang provided, and this became Maude's favorite part of the day. Harvey would bring water from the well, cold and clean, and they would sit with their backs against the house wall and drink, and say things or not say things as the moment required, and the prairie spread out before them in the shimmering heat, enormous and beautiful and entirely theirs. She showed him her father's journals during one of those midday hours. Thomas Hadley had kept journals for 30 years, thin notebooks in tight, careful handwriting that chronicled weather and soil conditions and crop yields, and the 1,000 small observations of a man who paid attention to the world he lived in. Harvey read them with a concentrated attentiveness that moved her. He turned the pages carefully, sometimes going back to reread a passage, occasionally making a small sound of recognition at something Thomas had observed about the land. He knew this place, Harvey said. He knew it deeply. He spent his whole life learning it, Maude said. "There is a passage here from 1879, Harvey turned back several pages. "He says the East Ridge soil responds to crop rotation in a way that surprises him every time, and that he intends to try winter wheat following sorghum next cycle." He looked up. "Have you done that?" "Not yet. I have been too focused on the immediate season. It might be worth thinking about for the year after. If the yield this autumn supports the renegotiation, you will have room to experiment. The year after." She noticed that he said it with the easy confidence of a man who assumed he would be there for the year after, and the ease of it, the quiet assumption, settled over her like something warm. "Harvey," she said. He looked at her, the journal still open in his hands. "When October comes," she said, "and the debt is settled and Prout has his agreement and there is nothing more that needs proving, what do you want to do?" He held her gaze. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the question was careful and honest and gave her all the space she needed. She looked out at the fields. The heat was rising from the earth in visible waves, and the wheat beyond the fence was golden and vast in hers, and she thought about her father's journals and the 11 years he had spent building something on this ground, and she thought about the year after and the year after that, and she thought about what it would mean to have a life on this land that was not solitary. "I would like you to stay," she said. "Not as a hired hand and not as a business partner. I would like you to stay as—" She paused, and then decided that she had never in her life benefited from being indirect. "I would like you to stay as the man who is going to marry me, if you want that. If that is what you want." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that contains a very great deal. Then Harvey set the journal down very carefully on the porch boards between them and reached over and took her hand in both of his, and he said, "Maude Hadley, I have wanted exactly that since approximately the 3rd week of April, and I was trying to give you sufficient time to arrive at the same conclusion without feeling rushed." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her. "Sufficient time," she said. "You are a woman who makes decisions in her own time," he said. "I have very much respected that about you." "Well," she said, "my time has arrived." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old-fashioned and sincere that her heart turned over in her chest. And then he held her hand and they sat on the porch in the July heat and looked out at the fields, and everything that had been uncertain about the future became considerably less so. August came with the harvest. The wheat went first, and it was a good harvest. Better than good. Harvey had borrowed the Brenner Operations mechanical reaper for the week. They were not using it, and the arrangement was neighborly and cost nothing. And they worked the south field from the first light of morning until the light failed in the evening, 5 days running, the reaper taking the wheat in long even swaths and Maude behind it binding the sheaves with a speed and efficiency that made Harvey say, near the end of the 4th day, "I have worked harvest with men who were not as fast as you." "I know," she said, without false modesty, and tied another sheaf. The thrashing took another week, done with the help of 2 farmhands from a neighboring operation who worked for a share of the threshed grain, which was the old and honest way of doing things before machinery made the old ways obsolete. By the 3rd week of August, Maude had 68 acres of wheat threshed and the grain in the barn, and when she ran the numbers in the evening light at the kitchen table with Harvey sitting across from her, the yield was better than the best she had projected. "This is enough," she said. "This is enough to pay Prout the full balance, not just service the debt." Harvey looked at the numbers. "With the corn still coming, you will have a surplus." "A surplus," she repeated, as though the word were new and she was trying it out. "I have not had a surplus in 4 years. Your father's debt is cleared," Harvey said. "The land is yours outright." She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was warm in the August evening, the windows open to the night air, the candle on the table making a small, steady circle of light in the room. Through the window she could hear the sound of the prairie at night, crickets, the distant sound of frogs from the creek direction, the soft movements of the horses in the barn. "I want to go to Prout tomorrow," she said. "I want to pay him in full, and I want it in writing that the note is satisfied." "We will go together," Harvey said. She looked at him across the table. "Harvey, yes, thank you," she said it simply, without qualification. "I know I can be difficult about accepting help, and I know that what you have done here has been more than anyone had a right to expect. I want you to know that I understand that." He looked at her steadily. "You do not owe me thanks, Maude. I told you in April. I did not want to let you do this alone. That was not an offer of assistance. That was a statement of what I intended." He paused. "And what I intend now is considerably expanded from where it was in April," she smiled. "As is mine." They went to Colton Ridge the following morning, Maude and Harvey together in the farm wagon with Sunday pulling easy and the August sky enormous and blue above them. The drive into town took an hour, and they talked easily the whole way about the corn harvest coming and about the lawyer in Garrison, who would need to be engaged for the repayment paperwork, and about what they wanted to do with the Eastern Ridge section next spring, whether to try Thomas's winter wheat following sorghum rotation or to try a different approach. Colton Ridge was a proper town for the Plains era, a main street of timber frame businesses, a general store and a feed merchant and a hotel and a barber shop and a church at the far end and the bank in the middle of it all, its painted sign visible from the edge of town. People on the boardwalk watched the wagon come in with the usual small-town interest. Randall Prout was behind his desk when they walked in, and his expression went through several distinct phases in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and finally, a carefully composed professional courtesy. "Miss Hadley," he said, and glanced at Harvey. "Mr. Prout," Maude said. She set the leather satchel she had brought on the desk in front of him, and the sound it made had the solid, particular weight of a great many things being resolved. $340, full balance, as agreed. I will need a receipt marked paid in full, and the note returned to me marked satisfied. Prout opened the satchel and looked at the money inside. His carefully composed expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been in another kind of man, something close to respect. He counted the money. He wrote the receipt. He retrieved the note from the file cabinet behind him and marked it satisfied in ink with the date and his signature, and handed both documents across the desk to Maude. She checked them. She folded them carefully and put them in the satchel. "Thank you, Mr. Prout," she said. "I trust this concludes our business." "It does," he said. "Miss Hadley, I want you to know that I never doubted." "You doubted considerably," she said pleasantly. "But the outcome is what matters. Good day." She walked out of the bank into the August sunshine with Harvey a step behind her, and when the door swung closed behind them, she stopped on the boardwalk and took a long breath of warm, dusty air and felt the thing she had been carrying since April lift off her shoulders all at once, completely and finally, and the lightness that remained was extraordinary. Harvey came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked at him, and the sun was full on his face, and he was watching her with that expression she knew so well now, warm and direct and genuinely interested in her answer. "Like the land is actually mine," she said. "For the first time since my father died, it actually feels like mine." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said, "because it is." They went to the general store after, where Maude bought flour and salt, and a bolt of good blue cotton she had been watching for months. And Harvey bought tobacco, not for himself, but because he had noticed that Clara Fitch used a pipe, and he thought it would make a suitable gift. And they drove home in the warm afternoon with the satchel holding the satisfied note and the receipt, and the sun going gold over the prairie. And Maude felt the specific happiness of a person who has fought for something important, and won without having to sacrifice anything essential. Harvey proposed properly that evening. He had, he told her later, been planning it since July, which she found both amusing and characteristic of him. He had ridden into Garrison the previous month and spoken to the jeweler there, which was how he came to have a small gold ring with a single garnet stone, which was modest and beautiful and exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen herself. He asked her on the porch after supper, in the long blue dusk, with the prairie spreading out before them and the first stars coming visible in the eastern sky. He went down on one knee on the porch boards, which she had not expected and which made her breath catch. "Maude Hadley," he said, looking up at her with dark, steady eyes, "I came to this place in April with very little, and I have found here everything I have been looking for 15 years. I found good work and good land and a woman who is the finest person I have ever known." He held up the ring. "I would like to spend the rest of my life on this land with you if you will have me. I am asking you to be my wife." She looked at him for a moment. The dusk was soft around them. The fireflies were beginning in the grass. "Harvey Slater," she said, "I have not changed my mind since July." He laughed, really laughed, startled and delighted, and she held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger, the garnet catching the last light. And he stood up and she went into his arms, and it was the first time she had allowed herself to be held by anyone in a very long time, and it was entirely the right thing, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt the full depth of the safety of it. "We should get married before the corn harvest," she said into his shoulder. "Yes," he agreed, his voice warm. "Clara Fitch will want to be involved. She will be insufferable about it. I like Mrs. Fitch. So do I. She will still be insufferable." He held her closer. Above them, The stars were coming out across the Kansas sky in the thousand-layered way of autumn approaching nights, and the prairie was dark and wide and absolutely theirs. They married in September, on a Saturday that turned out to be one of the finest autumn days Kansas produced that year. The sky an impossible blue, and the air warm and clean with the smell of ripe grass and turned earth. The ceremony was at the church in Colton Ridge, conducted by the minister there, a patient man named Reverend Gates who married farm couples often and understood that people who worked the land had a particular kind of seriousness about them, and required a ceremony that met that seriousness rather than sentimentalized it. Clara Fitch was there, radiant with satisfaction, wearing her good dress and what appeared to be strategic deployment of her best hat. She had indeed been involved in the preparations in a comprehensive and enthusiastic way that Maude had managed with only moderate exasperation. The Brenner family from the neighboring operation came, the father and mother and 2 adult sons, people who had known Thomas Hadley and were genuinely glad to see the farm continuing. The garrison lawyer came, which surprised Maude until she realized that Harvey had apparently made a friend there. The corn harvest had been completed the week before. Maude had sent a final accounting to Whitfield at the bank's parent company in Topeka, documenting the harvest yields, the satisfied debt, and the projected figures for the following season, partly because she had said she would and partly because she believed in thoroughness. Whitfield had sent back a brief professional acknowledgment that she found entirely satisfying. She stood at the front of the small church in her good dress, the blue cotton from the Colton Ridge General Store, made up by Clara's steady hand on a borrowed sewing machine, and looked at Harvey where he stood waiting for her at the altar, and he was watching her come down the aisle with an expression of such unguarded wonder and steadiness mixed together that she felt her eyes sting for just a moment. Reverend Gates kept the ceremony simple and sincere, which was what they had asked for. When he reached the moment of the vows, Harvey took both her hands in his and looked at her directly, in the way he looked at everything that mattered to him. "I vow to stand beside you," he said, "in every season, to work this land with you and for you, to be the person you can rely on absolutely and without reservation for the rest of my life." She held his hands and said her own vows, which she had written herself and which were not borrowed from any book, and which said in plain language that she loved him, and that she promised him the same steadiness he had promised her, and that she intended to keep that promise in the same way she intended to keep the land with her whole self and all her effort, and for as long as she lived. Outside the church, in the September sunshine, Clara Fitch wept with great enthusiasm and called it a wonderful occasion, and the Brenner family shook Harvey's hand with warm sincerity, and Maude stood in the sunlight with her husband's hand in hers and the garnet ring on her finger catching the light, and felt the full, completed shape of something that had begun on an April morning, with a stranger riding over a rise on a chestnut horse with a white blaze. They drove home in the wagon that afternoon, just the 2 of them, because it was their home to drive home to, and the September prairie was gold and amber around them, and the sky was enormous above them, and Harvey held the reins with one hand and held her hand with the other. "One season," she said, looking out at the land as they turned down the road toward the farm. "One season," he agreed. "It feels like considerably more than that. The best things usually do," he said. "They compress time around them." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Sunday pulled them steadily down the road. The barn was visible now over the rise, and beyond it the house with its kitchen window that caught the afternoon light, and beyond that the fields where the harvested wheat stubble was turning silver and the corn stalks stood stripped and dry, and the sorghum had been cut, and the whole of it rested now in the good tired way of land that had worked hard and been well tended. They lived well in the seasons that followed. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard in the way that Kansas winters are frequently hard cold that came in from the north with conviction. Ice on the creek in January, snow that the wind shaped into dramatic drifts against the barn and the fence posts. They spent those months maintaining the livestock, repairing equipment, and planning the following year's planting with the detail and collaboration that came naturally to two people who thought about land the same way. They were warm in the house. They were warm in the way that two people who have found each other after long searching and great effort are warm, not complacently, not with the ease of people who have never worried, but with the deep specific warmth of people who know the value of what they have and are grateful for it every day. Harvey spent a portion of the winter building an addition to the house. He had said in October, after the harvest was done and the first real cold had come, that the house would need to be larger, and when she asked him why, he had looked at her with that steady, warm directness, and said simply that he expected they would have children if that was also her wish, and a house with one small sleeping loft above the kitchen was not going to be sufficient for the long term. "It is absolutely my wish," she had said. The addition went up on the south side of the house through November and December, Harvey working steadily through the cold with lumber he had ordered from the mill in Colton Ridge, and it became 2 rooms. A proper bedroom on the main floor, and a second room above that could serve as a nursery or storage depending on what the future required. The future required the nursery. In the spring of 1884, when the planting was underway, and the south field was once again turned and harrowed, and the wheat seed was going in, Maude told Harvey that they were going to have a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the evening, with the spring wind moving outside and the candle between them throwing its familiar warm light. She told him in her direct and simple way, watching his face as the information landed. What happened to his face was the most complete and unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. There was a moment of such pure, surprised joy that it looked like wonder, and then he reached across the table and took her hands and held them tightly and said her name. "Maude." "The doctor in Garrison confirms it," she said. "October, he thinks." "October," he said. His voice was careful with the weight of it. "The harvest will be in by then," she said. "I have been thinking about the timing." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed that full, startled, genuine laugh she had first heard in the 3rd week of May a year ago, because of course she had already thought about the timing in relation to the harvest, because she was Maude, and Maude thought about everything in relation to the land. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said, but she was smiling. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her in the kitchen in the spring evening for a long time, and she felt his hands against her back and his face against her hair and the solidity of him. And she thought about all the things that had to happen exactly as they happened for them to be standing here. Her father's death, the banker's ultimatum, a stranger riding over the rise on a chestnut horse on the 2nd day of her impossible season, and the mathematics of it, the sheer contingency of it, made her press closer to him and hold on. Harvey Daniel Slater, Jr. arrived in the world on the 4th of October, 1884, in the bedroom of the addition Harvey had built, delivered by Dr. Gaines from Garrison, who had driven out the night before when it became clear things were underway. He was a healthy boy with dark eyes and a tremendous opinion of his own lung capacity, and he announced himself to the Kansas prairie with a vigor that made Harvey stand at the bedroom window and appear to be carefully studying the horizon while composing himself. Maude lay in the bed with the baby on her chest and watched her husband's back and said, "He has your eyes." Harvey turned around. His face was completely undone, which she found she loved most of all the expressions she had collected from him over the past year and a half. "He has your jaw," Harvey said, coming to sit beside the bed. "A good jaw," she said. "The best jaw," he agreed, looking at his son with the concentrated awe of a man who had not expected to feel anything quite this large. She put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, instinctive steadiness that he brought to everything that mattered, and she watched him look at their son. And the October light was coming through the bedroom window, and the harvest was in, and the land was theirs, and the debt was long satisfied, and everything that had begun in a season of desperation had become this. Clara Fitch came the following day, Arriving in her wagon with preserved plums and a quilt she had been making in secret since May, which she presented with enormous satisfaction and considerable emotion. She held the baby for a long time and declared him a fine boy and looked at Maude with shining eyes. "Your father would have loved this," she said. "I know," Maude said. And then, because Clara deserved honesty, "I think about him every day. I think about what he built here. I intend to give this boy the same thing, a piece of ground that means something, with the understanding of what it cost and what it is worth." Clara nodded. "He would have approved of Harvey too," she added. "He told Harvey that I was going to outlast all of them," Maude said. "Every banker and every drought and every bad season." Clara smiled. "He was right, wasn't he?" Maude looked across the room to where Harvey was standing with the baby, pointing out the window at something, probably a horse, or possibly Luther the gelding, who had a talent for appearing at windows at significant moments, and speaking in a low, easy voice to a 3-day-old person who could not yet understand words, but seemed to be listening with great attention anyway. "He was right," she said. "The farm prospered in the years that followed with the steadiness of land that is well tended and well loved. Harvey proved, as Maude had intuited on the second day, to be a man of his word, in all respects thorough and inventive and reliable through every season, through the years when the rains came generously and the years when they did not, through the expansion of the operation when they took on the eastern ridge section that Thomas had always wanted to develop, through the building of the new larger barn in 1886 when the old one finally needed replacement. They tried Thomas's winter wheat following sorghum rotation on the East Ridge in 1885, and it worked beautifully, just as Thomas had suspected it would, and Maude wrote it into the farm journal she had begun keeping in her father's tradition, with the same careful handwriting and the same precise observations about soil conditions and weather and the yield differences between sections, because the record of the land was part of what made the land worth keeping. Harvey read those journals with the same concentrated attention he had brought to Thomas's journals, and sometimes in the evenings he would bring some detail to Maude's attention, a pattern Thomas had noticed or a method Maude had tried that had produced unexpected results, and they would talk it through together the way two people talk through things that both of them care about deeply, which is a particular kind of conversation that has the quality of collaboration at its best. In the summer of 1886, Maude found herself expecting again and told Harvey at the kitchen table in the evening in exactly the same way she had told him the first time, watching his face do the same complete and unguarded thing it had done before. "August, Dr. Gaines thinks," she said. "Before the harvest," Harvey said. "During the harvest," she corrected, "which is less than ideal timing." "We will manage," he said, and then, because he was Harvey, Clara will help. Clara did help, with the thoroughness and enthusiasm that characterized all of Clara Fitch's assistants. She came and stayed at the farm for the last week of August and into September, managing the house and the baby Daniel, who was nearly 2 and deeply interested in everything, while Harvey managed the harvest with help from the Brenner boys, and Maude managed the delivery of their daughter with Dr. Gaines on a Saturday afternoon, while the thrashing machine ran in the south field, and the sound of it came through the open window like the sound of the season doing what it was supposed to do. The girl they named Ruth Ellen Slater, Ellen for Maude's mother, who had died when Maude was 9. She was born with Maude's cheekbones and Harvey's stillness, a baby who looked at the world with dark, observant eyes and made her opinions known selectively but with great conviction. Harvey held her in the way he had held Daniel, with that same careful, concentrated tenderness, and looked at Maude over the baby's head with an expression that was so complete and full of everything that she could not have put it into words and did not try to. "Ruth," he said. "After my grandmother," Maude said. "She was the toughest woman in 3 counties by all accounts. A good name for a Kansas girl," he said. By the autumn of 1887, the Hadley Slater farm, as people in Colton Ridge had taken to calling it, was one of the most productive operations in that part of Kansas. Not the largest. There were outfits to the north with far more acreage and hired crews in the dozens, but consistently productive, and efficiently managed and debt-free, which in the prairie farming world of the 1880s was no small thing. The land was Maude's and Maude's father's before her, and she intended for it to be Daniel's and Ruth's after her, and the intention was not vague sentiment but active planning. She showed Daniel the fields when he was old enough to walk them, explaining in simple terms what each section produced and why, the way her father had showed her. She kept the journals. She taught Ruth to read the weather signs her grandmother had taught her, the cloud formations and wind directions and the smell of the air before a storm. Harvey built a swing on the oak tree behind the house for the children, and he taught Daniel to fish in the creek on summer evenings. And he read to Ruth from the books Maude had accumulated over the years. And on Sunday mornings, when the weather permitted, they drove into Colton Ridge for services and had dinner at the hotel afterward, because Maude said that a person who worked as hard as they both worked was entitled to someone else's cooking 1 day a week, and Harvey did not argue. On the evenings when the children were in bed and the work of the day was done, they sat on the porch the way they had always sat on the porch, looking out at the land in the long summer dusk or the autumn dark or the winter starlight. And the conversations they had were the accumulated conversations of people who had built a life together, practical and philosophical, and sometimes very funny and occasionally very serious. And always the conversations of two people who were genuinely interested in each other's minds. One October evening in 1887, exactly 4 years after Maude had paid Randall Prout $340 and walked out of the Colton Ridge Bank into the August sunshine, she and Harvey sat on the porch after supper with the prairie dark and wide before them, and the early stars coming out, and the children asleep inside. The journal she had been writing in that afternoon was on her lap. She had been recording the harvest numbers, another good year, one of the better ones, and the notes her father had made about the East Ridge soil composition and the crop rotation cycle. And she had been thinking, as she sometimes did, about the spring of 1883 and the banker and the list on the kitchen table and everything she had and had not had when that season began. "What are you thinking about?" Harvey asked. He was watching the stars come out with that peaceful absorption that she had learned years ago to recognize as one of his particular ways of being happy. "April of 1883, she said. He turned to look at her. "What about it?" "I was thinking about the list I made the night after Prout came, all the things I had and all the things I did not have." "What were you missing?" "Another pair of hands," she said. "That was how I thought about it then. I needed another pair of hands." He looked at her, quiet and attentive. "I got considerably more than that," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the familiar weight of his fingers around hers. The garnet ring caught the starlight. "So did I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land, the wheat stubble silver in the evening dark, the barn solid and large against the sky, the creek speaking its quiet night language somewhere in the distance, the fence posts marching their straight lines across the 160 acres that were hers and his, and would one day be Daniel's and Ruth's, and perhaps their children's children's after that, and felt the thing that she had been building toward her whole life. The thing that her father had believed in and staked everything on and had not quite lived to see completed. She felt it whole and actual and entirely real. The land was worth keeping. She had proved it. He had proved it beside her. And everything that came after, the harvest seasons and the bad seasons, and the children and the evenings on the porch and the conversations at the kitchen table, and all the ordinary and extraordinary days of a life built together on ground that meant something. All of it had grown out of that one season, that one bet against a banker in a bad situation, that one morning when a man rode over the rise and said, "I will not let you do this alone." And he had not. And she had not. And the stars came out one by one over Kansas in the wide and generous way of prairie stars, and the horses moved softly in the barn. And inside the house, Daniel and Ruth slept the deep sleep of children who were safe. And the farm that Thomas Hadley had begun, and Maude Hadley had refused to surrender, and Harvey Slater had refused to let her face alone, rested in the October dark, paid for and proved and permanently, irrevocably theirs.